especially thank you for your patience. Today we're going to talk about harm reduction and recovery. And notice at the recovery there's a question mark and a exclamation point at some level for surprise. I'm interested in having you look at the image that I have on the first page of this PowerPoint. The image that's just above the date of this presentation. What do you see there? As we get started, we're talking about harm reduction. And I'm talking about harm reduction in the context of recovery. What do you see in that image of those two hands as we start this focus on harm reduction? Anybody want to interpret that image? What do you see? Can you hear me? I got Sarah typing. Got John typing. How to make the meeting as safe and productive as possible. Okay. See two hands coming together. Yeah, two hands coming together. One hand representing harm reduction, whatever that is, and another hand representing recovery. We talk more about recovery, but let's think about and talk about harm reduction. I hope that's why we're here. Let's move to the next slide. This webinar will offer us an opportunity to identify harm reduction and its range of services. Describe the principles of harm reduction. Describe the benefits that harm reduction has in a recovery process. Examine what harm reduction means for people who use substances, and identify concerns that people have had about harm reduction, many of those that we talk about in Recovery Coach Academy. And understand the importance of integrating recovery into harm reduction efforts. As I was exploring and researching this particular topic, this concept of the importance of integrating recovery into harm reduction efforts really struck me as interesting. But more importantly, I want you to be open to a process of thinking about harm reduction and thinking about harm reduction's place in the recovery process. In many ways, that's what this title is speaking about, harm reduction and recovery. It's not something we connect all the time. Let's move on. How willing and able are you to support abstinence and or harm reduction? One of the activities that we did in Recovery Coach Academy is to offer you an opportunity to look at multiple pathways of recovery. And one of those pathways of recovery we ended up describing as harm reduction. I'm curious, and especially in relation to how willing and able are you to support, more particularly harm reduction and or abstinence in the process of recovery. I'm curious, after Recovery Coach Academy, how much learning did you do about the concept of harm reduction? And please be honest. I mean, think about it. How much learning did you do to better understand harm reduction after Recovery Coach Academy? Just a question, no judgment, no blame, just a curiosity I have. Because I know for my own self, it's amazing as a result of doing this research and developing this webinar and offering you this webinar, I've learned a lot. This is the first thing that really so much to learn, but excited to learn. I agree, Sarah. There is so much to learn, and let's be excited and passionate about learning. Because again, we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what we don't know, what will be helpful and what's not helpful. So if we want to have as many resources as we can bring to bear when we talk about helping people with recovery, please be as aware and as understanding as you can be around this concept of harm reduction. And I think that's why, Stacy and I thought, decided to do this webinar. It's exciting. Here we go. Harm reduction. Type of recovery. This comes from Recovery Coach Academy Participants Manual. Remember this? Moderation-based recovery, the sustained deceleration of alcohol, other drug use, and/or gambling to a subclinical level that is a level that no longer meets diagnostic criteria. Do you remember this description of a type of recovery as we were talking about our ability to support multiple pathways of recovery? Good, it's coming back, Sarah. Excellent. Moderation-based recovery. And we ask participants to what is moderation-based recovery, another name for it. More times than not, participants will say it's harm reduction. And again, the source is Recovery Coach Academy Participant Manual. Remember this. So again, the question becomes, how much have you learned about this moderation-based recovery, this particular concept called harm reduction, in your own preparation to be open to multiple pathways of recovery, one of which might be presented a person's intention to practice harm recovery, harm reduction, and/or a person's already practicing harm reduction. How willing and able are you to support it? And again, how able are we to support something if we don't know a whole lot about it? So again, let's be open to the prospect of learning more about harm reduction and its opportunity to support a recovery process. It's important to meet people where they're at, but not leave them where they're at. This was one of the quotes that came about as I was looking at harm reduction, and someone spoke to being harm reduction as being this. We talk a lot about meeting people where they're at. But I like this concept of not leaving them where they're at. And that has to do, I think, as we think about it and talk about it, harm reduction's principles and harm reduction's philosophy. I hope that unfolds for you as we move forward. I want to remind us of the 4 laws of change. And you hear me talk about this a lot. And it's actually a Native American concept. And it says change comes from within, i.e. we can't make anybody change unless it comes from inside of them. In order for change to occur, development must occur. And in order for development to occur, there must be preceded by a vision. So in working with people, we want them to have a vision of what they want their change to be. As a part of the law of change that I'm putting particular emphasis on in relation to this particular webinar, a great learning must take place. And of course, we must create a healing force. But that great learning that must take place, for me, has translated in my own art of coaching recovery. It is translated into the concept of if we're not open to learning, it's very difficult to change. And that applies also to ourselves as recovery coaches. So I put the 4 laws of change in here, and I focus on a great learning must take place. Because a great learning must take place in order for us to be open to the prospect of understanding our willingness and ability to support harm reduction as a part of a person's recovery process. That's clearly what's unfolded for me as I'm looking at this. Okay. Can you still hear me, folks? I want to make sure I'm audioed. Excellent. I got you, Sarah. Okay, 2 schools of thought. The opposing turf. And again, we develop a working agreement in Recovery Coach Academy, primarily in many ways to get us to the point where we are open to disagree around certain concepts. And look at this. 2 schools of thought. The opposing turf. On the left-hand side, abstinence-based treatment. The goal of immediate and complete cessation or abstinence-based lifestyle. 12-step recovery. That's what I learned in treatment in my initial stages of looking at recovery. Harm reduction, on the other hand, is minimizing injury to self, others, and the community. Have you ever thought about harm reduction in that way? Does that make sense to you? Harm reduction, minimizing injury to self, others, and the community. This is the piece that really solidified this concept of harm reduction for me in the context of as being an important part of a recovery process. 2 schools of thought. They may be opposing turf. However, I think they have the ability to coexist when we think about offering recovery. And we'll look at that. Harm reduction. Harm reduction includes policies, programs, and practices intended to keep people safe and minimize death, disease, and injury from high-risk behavior. Harm reduction is especially in relation to psychoactive substance use. Harm reduction is policies, programs, and practices. It's much more organized and it's much more structured than I ever believed it to be. Think about that. My initial connection with harm reduction was when I started working on the Mashantucket Pequot Reservation, about 30 years ago, and I was talking to and at that point I was very much abstinence-based. That's what my recovery was. So much was based in 12-step philosophy. And as I was talking to a social worker who had been on the reservation for a good 20 years, and we talked about helping people with substance use issues, she made it real clear that I might want to rethink my thoughts about abstinence-based helping. And it made sense because many people in the community struggled with stress and struggled with substance use, but that use of substances was something that they were using to offset other problems in living and other difficult situations they were having. Sarah states, I just was dealing with this with my very first recovery. I got her into treatment, but she went for the first intake, but couldn't see the doctor until another 2 weeks. And she said she was going to try and minimize use in a safer way so that she was still healthy and not high-risk behavior. I did have I'm losing. Oh, there's my thing. Okay. Yeah, and again, when I was presented with the concept of helping people who are using substances to offset the stress of a very difficult environment, it made sense to be open to their possibility of them, some called it tapering off, but minimizing the danger of that relationship while the person still made efforts to make some change. I'm gonna look forward to your typing, Sarah. Harm reduction recognizes that high-risk behavior may continue despite the risks. Of course it does. Harm reduction involves a range of support services and strategies to enhance the knowledge, skills, resources, and supports for families, communities, and individuals to be safer and healthier. It's all about safety. It's all about being more healthy when we talk about harm reduction. Looks like you're talking about, Sarah. This person said that they wanted to still be healthy and minimize or begin to decrease their usage, but at some level also affect that high risk behavior. This seems to make a sense in the connection that you're talking about, Sarah. Harm reduction. I like this image because it really speaks about she's going to try to minimize her usage in a safer way that was still healthy and not a high risk behavior. And I did have, is there more to that, Sarah, or am I not moving my cursor? Oh, there we go. And I did have a hard time understanding and dealing with the right thing to say, but she seems to be doing okay. So we wait. The words to give them something that I'm sure will come easier when it's not my first recovery. Yes, it's so situational, which not many understand outside this training. Yeah, we're going to see that. It's situational. It's also a collaborative effort. It's me collaborating with the recovery. It's respecting the wishes of the recovery. At some level, it's accepting what they are saying they will choose to do and be in their own recovery process, which in itself is a compassionate, collaborative opportunity to make a connection with another human being that truly treats them as a resource. How do I treat you? How do I How do I treat you as a resource if I don't collaborate with you? I don't respect you. I don't accept um, what you want. I don't, at some level, have compassion for your challenges of living well, but also compassion for your challenge to get this right for yourself, and also this prospect of empowerment. Nice way to think about harm reduction. And so much of that thinking about it is meeting people where they're at and clearly treating them as resources. And I think that's the challenge that we have, Sarah, when people offer us information that we may not necessarily, or options or ways of recovery that may not fit our paradigm or fit our own way of doing it, but we've got to meet them where they're at. It's critical that we're open to their process and their prospects. And this comes with practice. This is a part of developing your art, Sarah, and I'm hoping this will add to that. And I think a couple of points will be made that you've already talked about. Principles of harm reduction. I really found this helpful. This comes from the Harm Reduction Coalition, harmreduction.org. Principles of harm reduction is the Harm Reduction Coalition presents them. Harm reduction incorporates a spectrum of strategies from safer use to managed use, to abstinence, to meet drug users where they're at, and addressing conditions of use along with the use itself. We're addressing not only the use, but also the conditions of the use. That's paying attention to what has heart and meaning for the recovery, and it's also paying attention to the impact and influences of the recovery's environment. When we talk about creating a healing force, part of creating that healing force is meeting people where they're at and telling them the truth, but not blaming them or judging what they're doing, and helping them to better understand how what they're doing might be helping them or hurting them. Principle of harm reduction. Because harm reduction demands, and this is to your point, Sarah, that interventions and policies designed to serve substance abusers reflect specific individual and community needs, there is no universal definition of or formula for implementing harm reduction. Meeting people where they're at, attending to cultural differences. Culture is just a way of living, a way of being. And again, a person finds their way of recovering based upon their environment and their community and their individual needs. A very important point. Principles of harm reduction. I threw this one in because it gives us more information. It's the user's decision to use is accepted. The user is treated with dignity and respect, which is treating them as a resource. The user is expected to take responsibility for their behavior. We expect that. User has a voice, and their voice is their power, and their voice is listened to as we actively listen and have conversations that matter. The user focuses on reducing the harm, not the consumption, and no predefined outcomes. I think one of the greatest challenges of supporting harm reduction is to be open to the outcome of what the recovery who's practicing harm reduction does, and not attached to the outcome that we have, whether that be abstinence or our way of looking at what recovery ought to look like. So when we look at these principles of harm reduction on this particular image, it's about the user's decision to use. And how they choose to do that is accepted and acceptable. And again, if you remember Recovery Coach Academy, we're not giving people a blank check or total openness to, at some level, maybe stepping into a hole and hurting themselves as a result of their harm reduction. But we're in our motivational interviewing, in our asking good questions, in our active listening to hear what's really going on, we're constantly helping people to think about if it's helping them or hurting them. We're constantly asking people to think about how's your approach towards your recovery of harm reduction helping you or hurting you, and how's it working for you. Harm reduction is a strength-based and client-centered. Again, that ties into what we do as coaches of recovery. Recovery coaching is a strength focused, strength-based model, and it focuses on the recovery. It's about the recovery. It's not about me. So what a wonderful fit with what harm reduction speaks to. And we'll help you look more at how it speaks to it. More principles of harm reduction. The Harm Reduction Coalition considers the following principles central to harm reduction practice. Again, this is the science of harm reduction as presented by the Harm Reduction Coalition. Accept that illicit and illicit drug use is part of our world and chooses to work to minimize its harmful effects rather than ignoring or condemning those effects. Principles of Harm Reduction understands that drug use as a complex, multifaceted experience that involves a continuum of behaviors from severe use to total absence, and acknowledges that some ways of using drugs are clearly safer than others, and makes an effort to engage in those safer practices. It's not about getting a person to necessarily stop at that point, but getting a person to minimize their harm by using and being safer in their approach to use. It establishes a quality of individual and community life and well-being, not necessarily the stopping of all drug use as the criteria for successful interventions and policies. So what that's saying to me is that the quality of individual and community life and the quality of well-being doesn't necessarily mean that a person has to stop using. It's another pathway of recovery. Harm reduction considers the following principles central for harm reduction practice. It calls for the non-judgmental, non-force offering or provision of services and resources to people whose drugs and communities in which they live in order to assist them in reducing any harm of those drugs. We're not judging, we're not forcing services to people, and hopefully these services will open people's eyes up to other possibilities, or if not other possibilities, clearly the importance and the practice of reducing the harm of their relationship with the substances that they're using. It's paying attention to safety, and it's paying attention to a larger concept of what we're doing in recovery. The harm reduction ensures that drug users and those with a history of drug use routinely have a voice in the creation of programs and policies designed to serve them. We've done that well in helping recoveries to have a voice in recovery. Do we do the same in helping people who choose to utilize harm reduction to have a voice in recovery and in their recovery process? And are we listening to that voice? It affirms the drug users themselves as the primary agents of reducing the harms of their use and seeks to empower users to share information and support each other in strategies which meet their actual conditions of use. Again, folks, being open and accepting and willing to at least explore and make a humble effort to support a drug user's efforts to empower themselves is treating them as resources. I continue to make the connections between the principles of harm reduction and treating recoveries as resources. It fits for me, and it fits well. And I didn't realize how well it fit until I did this webinar. We recognize that the realities of poverty, class, racism, social isolation, past trauma, sex abuse, discrimination, and other social inequities do affect both a person's vulnerability to and capacity for effectively dealing with drug-related harm. So in many ways, harm reduction helps us to look at the environment in a way that we may not look at it when we're offering people cookie-cutter treatment, or when we're so narrowly focused in on what a pathway of recovery might be for a person, and maybe that person's pathway has clearly evidence of its utilization is based upon recognizing realities of their environments in which they're living in. In many ways, when you think about it, harm reduction, and this just comes to mind as I'm thinking about it and I'm offering it, harm reduction is a person who's making a humble effort at recovery by reducing the harm of their relationship with their substance by not necessarily stopping using that substance, but making efforts to make that use safer and saner for them. They are in many ways practicing a process of self-empowerment. They're practicing their own clear cultural competence or cultural focus on what's in their environments and what they need to address. Harm reduction does not attempt to minimize or ignore the real and tragic harm of danger associated with illicit or drug use. We're not saying it's not harmful, we're just saying how do we reduce the harm. We're not minimizing the tragedy and the harm, and we're not saying that people would not gain advantage from making change, but we're helping people to make change maybe quicker, maybe less quicker than we might want them to, accepting where they are. Another interesting image. What is harm reduction? It refers to an approach designed to reduce harmful consequences associated with high-risk activities. We do not try to save or rescue anyone. What we end up doing is we support them wherever they are without judgment or assumption. As a creative problem solver, and especially as a creative problem solver working with recoverees seeking to solve their problems, I'm especially impacted by that second statement, where I find myself, for me, creative problem solving with recovery is telling the truth as I see the truth without blaming them or judging them. So in talking with them about their harm reduction activities associated with reducing their high risk activities, I'm not trying to save them. I'm not trying to rescue them. I'm not trying to make them believe what I believe. But what I'm trying to get them to think about is, how's that working for you? And is it truly offering you an opportunity to reduce the harm that your relationship with substances has? Services are available to prevent harms from substance use. And again, these are probably more familiar to us when you start to think about it than we thought about it when we were looking at in Recovery Coach Academy, because harm reduction takes many forms, and some of these forms you've seen, no doubt. Needle distribution recovery programs that distribute sterile needles or other harm reduction supplies, recover used needles, and provide information and containers for their safe disposal. You've seen that, haven't you? That's harm reduction. Substitution therapies that substitute illegal heroin with legal non-injection methadone or other prescription opioids. We talk about this. We see a lot of this. We can talk about this. This is harm reduction. Another service is take-home naloxone program that provides an antidote to reverse an overdose, thereby preventing brain injury due to depressed breathing and death. Again, harm reduction. We're familiar with this. And we seem to be comfortable with it, or at least I have been. Supervised consumption facilities that help prevent overdose death and harms by providing a safer, supervised environment for people using substances. Other services, outreach and education services that make contact with people who use substance to encourage safer behavior. Peer support programs that are groups run and attended by people who use substances to improve the quality of their life and to address gaps in services. So in many ways, people are using substances for what they believe to be the right reasons, to improve the quality of their life, to better be able to function in the dysfunction of their environments and in their lives, even though they might be harmful. But again, they're trying to address the gaps that they have in getting the services they need many times by preventing harm versus giving up to total substance use. Benefits of harm reduction that have been identified. It reduces hepatitis and HIV. It reduces overdose deaths and early deaths among substance users. It has the capacity to reduce injection use in public places and reduce the number of used needles in public places. I'm looking for your typing, Sarah. Please go for it. Reduce the sharing of needles and other substance use equipment. Are you familiar with these types of resources, folks? Have you seen them as being beneficial to reduce harm? And have you made that connection between what we talk about, abstinence or cessation or deceleration of use, when we talk about helping recoveries from substance use issues? Again, when you look at what's been offered and many of the benefits of harm reduction, not necessarily within the quiet realm of recovery coaching or coaching people through recovery, but it does have a place for recovery. I think people using the smoke marijuana is a high issue, and sure it is. And how do you address that issue? I mean, how do people approach that issue? Are people judgmental about people who practice the marijuana maintenance program? And more particularly, in my role as a recovery coach, how willing and able am I to support, not necessarily accept, and not necessarily condone, but to support a pathway of recovery in which a person practices using marijuana as a way to offset the harm of their relationship with other substances and or even marijuana. Got some people typing. Look forward to what you have to say. What are you learning, Sarah, that you're giving an amen to? Because for me, it's critical for the takeaways in this particular webinar to affect your ability to support multiple pathways of recovery. And it has been identified that there are people who utilize harm reduction many times in the form of their marijuana maintenance, many times in the form of, say, if a person has a heroin or a harder drug issue, they feel that their use of alcohol can offset. The issue becomes, I choose, and this is a very powerful piece for me. I work in a prison, says John. How does harm reduction apply in a prison experience? You know, the best answer to that, John, is to ask that good question of the people that you work with. What I would suggest that you teach them what you're learning about harm reduction, and then have a conversation that matters with them about harm reduction and its application to people who are coming through a prison setting. When you say you work in a prison, are you offering treatment? Are you offering recovery services? What kinds of conversations do you have with people about their relationship with substances? Are people open to having conversations about their relationship with substances? And where does the question come from? How does harm reduction apply in a prison? One thought, very interesting question. I'm curious. And in my curiosity, I'm in no way judgmental because I don't know what I don't know about how harm reduction is experienced in a prison setting, how it's thought about, how it might be planned for, or how we might have conversations with people who are trying to help recover. Someone I have in mind was, I was trying hard to make them realize that marijuana wasn't helping, but I think I need to work harder on meeting them where they're at instead of focusing on supporting all substance all at once. Meeting them where they're at is being open to their experience. Meeting them where they're at is being curious. And my curiosity helps me to be less judgmental. I'm curious about how the utilization of marijuana would help a person in their recovery process. That's a conversation that I want to have with a person instead of telling them what to do. It's about me treating them as a resource. And again, I don't have to believe in marijuana maintenance, but it's critical that I practice acceptance and I practice the willingness and the ability to support a pathway of recovery that may not be one that I am willing to engage in. But it's not about me. It's about the person that we're making a humble and honest effort to help. I've got a couple of people typing. I'm really intrigued by this thought about, what are we thinking about when we're thinking about harm reduction in the context of a prison setting? I have a CCAR recovery coach in my office today, and also another employee. Are you connected to a jail or prison that promotes harm reduction? Are you talking to the people with you, John? And are there prisons or jails that I've never heard? But again, I've not asked the question. Are you connected with a prison or a jail that promotes harm reduction? I wouldn't know. And would I ask the question? And in asking the question, what might be the response or their perceptions? See, so many times is the ability to ask these difficult questions, the ability to get to know more, but they're difficult questions. Harm benefits of harm reduction: it reduces crime and increases employment among people who use substances. The ability to have a healthier and a better quality of life also possibly puts the person in the ability to function and participate in their lives better. Benefits include education about safer injecting and smoking and reducing the frequency of use. It's education about safer sex and sex health and increased condom use. It's increasing referrals to treatment programs and health and social services. Benefit of harm reduction efforts. Harm reduction values life, choice, respect, and compassion over judgment, stigma, discrimination, and punishment. Can you see that? Can you embrace that? Harm reduction values life, meaning we're making safer efforts to improve and increase the quality of one's life, despite using substances that can hurt that quality. Harm reduction is about choice. It's about respect of the person's efforts, honest efforts to change, and it's compassion in their honest efforts to change. Because not everybody feels safe or comfortable or strong enough to do what you and I might want them to do, feeling it's the best thing for them to do. So do we reject them? Do we push them aside? Or do we work with them? Working with people, treating people as resources, is the opportunity to help people to tackle the difficult questions and to work together to see where their honest efforts to change take them. Not where I want to take them, where they want to go. What harm reduction means for people who use drugs: makes it easier, as easy as possible for people who use drugs to get help. Services are open to all people who use at any stage in their use. Sorry for the double there. Help is available when someone using wants to move in a new direction. And services aim to involve people in their own health by keeping them connected to the health system. I like these. I mean, there's a case for the ongoing exploration of a person's best efforts to be safer and healthier. And in that being safer and healthier, we can have conversations that matter, that help them to think that through, and help them to think about what services that they might avail themselves to be able to do that, as well as the potential or the possibility of connecting to treatment beyond their connections to the health system. Does that make sense to you? Can you see that piece as being an exciting opportunity to keep people around health and well-being versus reject that effort? Harm reduction can empower people to improve the quality of their lives. They begin to learn about what's available and what's possible. They may not have understood that. And they're learning about it in the context of what they think is their best effort to make the change. And yet they might learn about other potential or possibilities as a result of being open to learning, being committed to learning. That's critical to this process. Any concerns about harm reduction? Of course there are. Someone asked the question, could harm reduction make it easier for people to use substances and stop them from quitting? Big concern. Answer being, people who are dependent on substances may not want to quit, or they may continue to relapse. Harm reduction reduces the risks of substance abuse, including the spread of infections like HIV and hepatitis. Harm reduction creates opportunities for people to lead healthier lives. We open people up to possibilities. We make opportunities more prevalent. If we're constantly focusing on, abstinence or a way of recovery that's not in conjunction with how this person has evolved in their best efforts to manage their lives through this process, we may lose an opportunity to truly help them. It's about them. It's not about me. I'm waiting for your typing, Sarah. Could harm reduction activities encourage people to use substances? Research shows that harm reduction activities do not encourage substance use. People are using what they're using. It's not an encouragement to use more or to use other. Does harm reduction drain funding from treatment programs for substance dependence? Treatment programs for substance dependence are part of harm reduction. Specific harm reduction activities are cost effective and prevent costly outcomes like hepatitis and HIV. Is there a website or something to find different resources in my area or places that do these things for harm reduction? I would Google harm reduction and where you're living. I would also engage people who are through methadone programs or think about needle exchanges. I mean, these are all things you can Google and make it local with, your state, your city, and your state, and see what you get. That's how I tend to get this stuff. Yeah, I would too. I mean, because again, I researched, and it's amazing what I found out, and I continue to find out. Concerns about harm reduction. Does harm reduction mean trying to legalize substances? Is the fear. Legalization is not part of harm reduction. Harm reduction applies to both legal and illegal substance use. A high school organizing safe rides home after graduation because parents realize their teenagers may be drinking is an example of harm reduction. The importance of integrating recovery into our harm reduction work. Rather than talking about harm reduction and recovery as if they were separate things, think of harm reduction and recovery as sitting along a continuum of increasing safety, self-efficacy, i.e. self-effectiveness, and independence. Harm reduction gradually reduces and people gradually need less help from services. Safety and health is the basis from which this work begins. Without safety and health, there is nothing. Recovery often starts with people taking responsibility for reducing their own harm and genuinely engaging with a worker around this. So we're doing it anyway. Why not talk more about doing it? Why not talk more about integrating harm reduction efforts into a recovery process? Reducing harm and safeguarding health are our first priority, and we have a firm duty to emphasize the progressive nature of this continuum and the need to keep pushing towards as independent an end result as possible for the person. It's about the recovery. It's not about me. It's about treating the recovery as a resource who independently, with our support, finds their way. If substance dependence is a situation in which the ball inevitably rolls down the hill, sometimes failing to put sufficient emphasis on pushing the other way is a job half done. So we suggest we deliver high-quality harm reduction from day one and throughout the nudges and pulls towards self-care, empowerment, self-efficacy, and recovery is an integral part of combined interventions. What that says to me is that when we talk about harm reduction, when we talk about the ability to not let the ball roll down the hill, but to find a way to begin to push it back up the hill, we're pushing a process of reducing harm, policies, and procedures that have an opportunity to combine with the intervention of recovery that we're also embracing. Harm reduction is safer when it can be sustained. Recovery is safety. We prefer to have, we prefer never to have one without the other. Harm reduction is safer and recovery is safety. We need them both to move the person up the hill. And the last quote from a person heavy duty in recovery and in treatment: I see harm reduction as a way of engaging people as a part of that path of recovery. And so do I at this point. I mean, I'm even more so than I've been before, because I think it has many of the parallels to what we look for in recovery are helping people to engage in harm reduction. Any questions, thoughts, or comments? We got a couple of minutes left. I so much thank you, John and Sarah, for being here. Thank you for the questions that you had, which were great questions. And bottom line for me is I hope this helps. Again, I learned a lot doing this. And again, I cannot emphasize the importance of learning and the commitment to learning. And I hope this is an opportunity, as you've been exposed to some of this information, and hope you've learned some things from it, the demonstration of the ongoing learning that it takes to be the best recovery coach that you could be. You're welcome, John. Thank you, and I hope to see you. I hope you come around again. And I hope this was helpful. Thank you for answering all my questions. I am very new and very excited to learn. LOL, but I still have ways to go. I love these webinars. Thank you. Keep coming. And give Stacy any suggestions you may have that would be helpful for you, Sarah. And keep coming and keep learning. That's how you get better. Learn the science and practice your art. Practice your art based upon what you're learning about what recovery coaching is and how we do it. Thank you, folks. Have a good day.